My name is Mohammed Almazi, and this is Truth Defense. On the 6th of August, 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb codenamed Little Boy on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing between 70,000 and 110,000 men, women, and children. 3 days later, they dropped another bomb codenamed Fat Man on the city of Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40 to 70,000 people. The U.S. government would later state that the dropping of these two atomic bombs was necessary to save up to 1 million American lives and even Japanese lives, which were ultimately spared from a full-scale invasion. To discuss the truth of the matter on the 78th anniversary of the use of the two nuclear weapons against Japan is Professor Peter Kuznick. Professor Kuznick is professor of history, founder and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, and he has also authored and co-authored numerous books, including The Untold History of the United States, Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America, and Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives. Thank you for joining us, Professor Kuznick.
My pleasure, Mohammed.
So in July this year, which is only last month, Time magazine published an interview with Evan Thomas, a writer and correspondent and editor for 33 years for Time and Newsweek, about a book Thomas wrote called The Road to Surrender. I would like to read part of what he said so that you can address it. In this interview, Thomas is asked whether there are any myths about the history that he wanted to debunk or set the record straight on. Thomas responded, quote, "The big one was that the Japanese were ready to surrender and would have surrendered even if we had not dropped those bombs. I think that is a myth. Oppenheimer seems to have believed that the weapon was used against a country that was about to surrender, as he puts it, essentially defeated. The Japanese were essentially defeated. That's true. Their fleet had been sunk and their cities had been burned, but they were not ready to surrender," Thomas says. And then when he's asked about what led to the Japanese surrender, which was officially on the 2nd of September, although declared in August that year, he says 2 atomic bombs forced them to. The dominant reason the U.S. used the bomb was to end the war. The U.S. thought the only way to end the war was to use these 2 terrible weapons. So how do you respond to that? And what can you say to that part of Thomas's response?
Well, I'm sorry that Evan Thomas wrote that. It's completely wrong. It's at the heart of the fundamental myth that drives American exceptionalism. And it lies at the heart also of the lie that the U.S. government has been perpetuating since 1945. The idea that the atomic bombs were not only necessary, they were actually humane. They saved not only 500,000 American lives would have been lost in an invasion, but millions of Japanese lives that would also have been lost if the United States had to invade. So the bombs were not only necessary, they were moral, they were humane, they were in the interest of the Americans and the Japanese. But that's complete bullshit. And the American leaders knew that. Many of the scientists and others who were aware knew that at the time. And we certainly now, as historians, know that since. Although, sadly, the new Oppenheimer movie, again, perpetuates that myth. We can get into that later. But it's not only Evan Thomas. It was Susan Rice, who wrote in the New York Times op-ed in 2019 that Truman saved her father's life. He was aboard a ship that was about to be part of the invasion of Japan, and dropping the atomic bomb saved his life. Her boss, President Barack Obama, was the first American president while in office to visit Hiroshima in May of 2016. And Obama had been urging him to go to Hiroshima since the start of his administration. Finally, he decided to go in May of 2016, which was still the right thing to do. But he went there in front of the cenotaph and he spread more lies. In the opening sentence, he says, "On a bright sunny day, death fell from the skies in Hiroshima. Death didn't fall from the skies. The United States dropped an atomic bomb. There's rather a difference. Then he goes on to say that World War II reached its brutal end in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Again, the heart of the American lie, the myth at the start of the American empire, or at least the current phase of it. I was also in Hiroshima. NHK, Japanese public television, brought me over there to do commentary. And it was sad to see Obama continue the obfuscation that's going on since 1945, since the atomic bombing, since Truman's initial announcements. What do we know? We know that in early February, Prince Konoe, the former prime minister, sent a note to the emperor, which he said, "I regret to inform you, but defeat is inevitable." The Japanese had effectively known since the Battle of Saipan the previous summer that they were not going to win militarily. And as Konoe says, the key really is how to prevent a communist revolution in Japan when the word spreads that we're surrendering. The Japanese War Council, Supreme War Council, in mid-May issued a statement saying that entry of the Soviet Union into the war will not only end the Japanese empire, it's going to lead to Japan's surrender. The United States knew that. We'd broken the Japanese codes. We've been intercepting their telegrams for years now. And beginning really in May, June, July, they were getting more and more desperate. In fact, President Truman himself on July 18th refers to the intercepted Japanese telegram as the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. The telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. Truman knew this. They all knew this. They knew there were two ways to end the war without use of the bomb. Number one, change the surrender terms. Let the Japanese know they could keep the emperor. The emperor to them was a divinity, divine force, and the thought of the United States coming in and executing the emperor was so unacceptable that they would have continued to fight. And then in the summer of 45, Douglas MacArthur, the head of the Southwest Pacific Command, issues a background report in which they say that execution of the emperor to them would be like the crucifixion of Christ to us. All would fight to die like ants. They knew that. In fact, almost all of Truman's advisors urged him to change the surrender terms, let the Japanese know they could keep the emperor. The only one serious advisor who had resisted was Jimmy Burns. And Burns becomes Secretary of State on July 3rd. And that's who Truman relied on. But all of the other top advisors in the State Department and the War Department urged Truman to change the surrender terms, but he refused to do so. The second way to end the war was to wait for the Soviet invasion. U.S. intelligence had been saying since April that Soviet entry into the war would convince all Japanese that further resistance is futile. It would lead to the surrender. Right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt implored Stalin to come into the Pacific War. But Stalin was fighting the war in Europe. Most Americans don't know, and probably most Brits don't know, that throughout most of the war, the U.S. and the British were fighting 10 German divisions between us, while the Soviets were fighting more than 200 German divisions. The Soviets were doing all the fighting. That's why even Churchill says the Red Army tore the guts out of the German war machine. We knew that. But for that reason, Stalin did not agree to come into the Pacific War till the meeting at Yalta in February of 45. And there he promises that the Soviets will come in 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. 3 months, which would put it right around August 8th, the exact time that it happened. What did Truman know? Truman went to Potsdam in mid-July. He had lunch with Stalin on July 17th. Stalin assures him the Soviets are coming in. Truman writes in his journal, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. He writes home to his wife Bess the next day. The Russians are coming in. We'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the kids who won't be killed. Truman knew that. And the question really is, why did the U.S. drop the bomb? The other thing to factor in is that they decided in May that the Japanese decided that their best way to get better surrender terms, meaning keeping the emperor, was to try to get the Soviets to negotiate on their behalf. So they offered the Soviets a lot of concessions to effectively get them better surrender terms. In early June, the former Japanese Prime Minister Hiroda met with the Soviet ambassador in Tokyo, Malik, and they had several meetings, after which Malik writes back to the Kremlin, the Japanese are desperate to surrender. The Soviets knew this better than anybody. And the Soviets also had spies. They had at least 2 spies in the Manhattan Project who were informing Stalin of what was going on. And so the Soviets knew that the bomb was not really dropped against Japan because the Japanese were already defeated, that the target of the bomb was much more the Soviet Union, that they were sending a message to the Soviets that if you interfere with America's plans in Europe or the Pacific, this is what you're going to get, and worse, much, much worse.
So I'd like to actually go into that a bit more, but before we get to that, could we address still the bombing and then the surrender? Because if you look at the surrender is first announced, I believe, of the emperor on the 15th of August, right? Which is 1 week after the dropping of the second bomb. Yes. And so then the question is, did the bombings result in the surrender, even if they weren't necessary to result?
No, what results in the surrender is the Soviet invasion. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria begins at midnight on August 8th. The Soviets blow through the Kwantung Army, the prized Japanese army. They destroy it within days. And then on the 13th of August, Prime Minister Suzuki was asked, why do we have to surrender so quickly? And he said, we have to surrender when we can surrender to the Americans. The Soviets have already taken Manchuria. They're going to take other parts of Japan. Pretty soon they'll have Hokkaido. And then the foundation of Japan will be destroyed. We must surrender when we can surrender now to the Americans. So that was the motivation. How do we know that conversation happened? He said it to, I think it was a Navy doctor. And we've got a record of that discussion.
Oh, there are records of these.
Oh yeah. We have and then also the American command also interrogated the Japanese leaders afterwards, and then we have various records that the Japanese have left as well. So we know from American sources, Japanese sources, and Soviet sources. But we anticipated, we knew that the Soviet invasion was going to have that effect. The Joint Intelligence Committee to the Joint Chiefs of Staff reported that in April. They reported that again in July. This was something that the Americans knew. And 7 of America's 8 5-star admirals and generals in 1945 are on record saying the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. Admiral William Leahy, who not only chaired the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was Truman's personal chief of staff. He said later that the atomic bombings of a thoroughly defeated Japan put us on the moral level of the barbarians of the Dark Ages. And he said, Truman said that they would hit military targets, then they went ahead and killed as many Japanese women and children as they could, which is what they wanted to do all along. And that was the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Eisenhower says this, MacArthur says this, they all did. King, Hap Arnold, Nimitz.
I believe even Bombs Away LeMay, who was responsible for overseeing the firebombing of Japan, which killed actually even more people than the 2 nuclear weapons, right? If I remember correctly, that's hundreds of thousands.
It depends on how you measure it, but certainly the immediate deaths in Tokyo, March 9th and 10th were enormous. 1 million people homeless, close to 100,000 dead. So that was horrible and devastating. But the U.S. firebombed, this is important, the U.S. firebombed 100 Japanese cities. We would wipe them out effectively. Oliver Stone and I visited the city of Toyama. We were invited there by the government just a few years ago because we wrote that 99.5% of the city of Toyama was destroyed in the firebombing. And so they invited us there. They actually opened up a firebomb museum while we were there. We met with the survivors. But it was the Japanese accepted that the U.S. could wipe out cities. They knew we could do that. And that did not change their calculus. And the atomic bombings were to them 2 more cities. They were horrible. Instead of 1,000 planes and 10,000 bombs, it was 1 plane and 1 bomb. So that made it more horrible. But that didn't change the equation. They accepted we could wipe out their cities. What they didn't, what they dreaded was the Soviet invasion. And as soon as that occurred, the foreign minister, the next morning, the top leaders all came there and said, what we feared has happened. We've got to sue for surrender now.
And we know that they were referring to the Soviet invasion when they say what we feared has happened.
Yeah, that's what they feared. That's what they anticipated. And that's what happened.
So then how long has this been known about the decision to drop the bomb? I mean, you've referred to 7 out of 8 of the highest ranking officers in the armed forces, making that clear about the breaking of the codes and how the Japanese telegrams and codes were being intercepted and read for months, if not a couple of years beforehand. That Truman as well had telegrams saying the Soviet entry means that the Japanese are finished. How long has this been known by the wider public or been accessible to the wider public?
Well, in 1965, my friend Gar Alperovitz wrote a book called Atomic Diplomacy. And he basically makes the case that the bomb was dropped as a means of pressuring the Soviets to go along with the United States post-war plans. But people said that earlier. The British Nobel-winning physicist P.M.S. Blackett said that, I think was late 45. Einstein said that the Soviets were the target very early. So there were people who knew this. In fact, it was not only the people, the progressives, people, the conservatives also. There was an article in National Review, William Buckley's conservative magazine in 1959, in which it stated the atomic bombings of Hiroshima, or opposition to the atomic bombings, has become part of the national conservative credo. Conservatives accepted that also, that it was unnecessary, horrific, and a sign of American depravity in this attempt to take over the world after World War II. So it's been known from the start, but it came out in book form in 1965. And then in 1995, Gar Alperovitz revisited it with a large staff, and they collected all the documents and were able to show a lot of what they had alleged and assumed and argued in 65. 30 years later, they had the documents, and now we have those documents.
Okay. And then we've referred to now Oppenheimer, the new film, the Christopher Nolan film, which I saw a few days ago so that I could ask you about it. And you've told me that you've seen it as well. So setting aside what we think about I mean, I found the acting to be quite good and what have you, although typical Nolan, there are multiple layers that I think are a bit unnecessary. But the focus, I was almost surprised, is a bit less on the actual bomb and the consequences of the bomb, although they're referred to and alluded to, and is more about a story about a scientist fighting to keep his security clearance, really, and the layers to that, although there's a lot about...
And what you have to realize is that's a much easier target for Christopher Nolan. I think in some ways it's a brave film. I mean, I think it's a terrific film. It's a really passionately anti-nuclear film, which we need. I mean, that's terrific. But unfortunately, some of the history is not accurate. But it's a lot easier to go after McCarthyism. Everybody hates McCarthyism in the United States. Even the conservatives, Republicans are appalled by McCarthy's excesses. So that's an easy and sympathetic target. That Oppenheimer was a victim of the national security state that was largely created as a result of the bomb and the need to suppress nuclear information.
So was there anything in there that I mean, it was 3 hours long, so he could have cut certain things. If you were advising him and you would have suggested
I wished he had. Now, the thing you have to realize is that it was based on a terrific book, American Prometheus, by my friends Kai Bird and Marty Sherwin. Marty passed away not too long ago, but Kai is still very young and active and has done a lot of interviews. And their book and certainly their careers are very different from the message in this film. In fact, on the 75th anniversary, Gar Alpovitz, Kai Bird, Marty Sherwin, and I did a series of international press briefings and webinars in order to combat the myth that this movie reinforces. And that's that the atomic bombings were just and necessary and that they ended the war. Now, to Nolan's credit, he raises 3 times, very, very briefly, in a way that most people would have totally missed, that there was real opposition to dropping the bomb. And he finally later has Oppenheimer admit that we bombed an already defeated Japan. But the preponderance of evidence and argument in the movie is that the bombs were necessary, that we did the right thing, that they ended the war, and that they avoided an invasion. And that, as we were discussing, is completely untrue. But Americans they don't believe it quite as much, because I saw a survey in May of 2016 in which 43% of Americans were opposed to the use of the atomic bomb in 45, and 42% supported it. That was the only survey I've ever seen. At the beginning, Gallup released a poll showing that 85% of Americans supported the use of the atomic bomb. A Roper poll later in 1945 showed that 22.3%, so more than 22% of Americans said they wished the Japanese had not surrendered so quickly so we could have dropped more atomic bombs on them. In the southwestern United States, that was 30%. So Americans hated the Japanese. They didn't see the Japanese as humans. They saw them as vermin. They saw them as cockroaches, maggots, or else monkeys. And they were happy that the United States dropped the bomb. They didn't have the information. And over the years, it's usually been about 55 to 45, sometimes 60 to 40 in favor of the use of the atomic bomb. But Oliver Stone and I made a big issue of this in our 12-part documentary film series that was on Showtime and then elsewhere, Netflix and every place. But also in our talks, we went around to most of the campuses, a lot of the campuses in the United States, and we showed our episode about the decision to drop the bomb, episode 3, which is very powerful. And we gave lectures and we gave our talks about the atomic bombings, because we see that as the starting point of the recent phase of the American empire. You can start in the 1890s. You can even start it with genocide of the Native Americans. We started in the 1890s with the Spanish-American War, and then the overthrow of the Aguinaldo government in the Philippines and the Filipino uprising. But really, the heart of it is the Cold War, and the United States dropping the bomb is one of the turning points in the Cold War, because the Soviets leaders interpreted it as if they were the target. They knew it. They knew the Japanese were defeated already. There was no reason to drop it on Japan. And they Stalin on down said that we are the target, and they were trying to intimidate us into capitulating on everything.
So you could say
that was before the Cold War started, really, supposedly.
Well, I was going to say, so we could say that dropping the bombs is what started the Cold War, because Roosevelt.
I would say that if Roosevelt had lived longer, then we would not have dropped the bombs, and there would not have been a Cold War. I would also say that Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 45, Henry Wallace, was even more anti-nuclear, anti-war, pro-development, pro-peace, wanted to get along with the Soviets, even more than Roosevelt, probably, anti-colonial. Had Wallace deserved to be the president after Roosevelt, not Truman. Gallup issued a poll on July 20th, 1944, the day that the Democratic Party convention began in Chicago, and asked the potential voters who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. 65% said they wanted Wallace back. Wallace was the second most popular man in the United States behind Roosevelt. He was a visionary. He was a thinker. Truman was a little nothing, but that's why they chose him, because they knew he would go along. And he would not offer any opposition. He didn't have any strong enemies. And Wallace was a visionary. The party bosses in the Democratic Party knew that Roosevelt would not survive another 4 years. And they were terrified at the thought of a progressive like Wallace becoming president. And so they decided on Truman. And then they had to force him through, sparse him down the throats of the Democratic Party delegates to that convention. And the first vote, Wallace was way ahead. And then all the deals started to kick in, and the bribes and the positions. And then finally, Truman got it on the third ballot.
So I know we're running out of time. So have you had the opportunity to review the recently released memos or reports from the National Security Archive on this anniversary? I believe one of them was published yesterday. I was just going to note you have. Okay.
Briefly, because I'm lecturing in Italy at the moment.
Yeah.
So just this morning, I quickly went through the documents about radiation. That's one of the things that's left out of the Nolan movie. I don't fault Nolan for that. But if you're going to spend 45 minutes developing the atomic bomb test in Trinity, I think you can spend more than 45 seconds talking about the opposition to using the bomb beforehand. The Leo Szillards and the others who knew and warned that the United States should not use the bomb even if it's ready, because it's going to lead to an uncontrollable arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union that could spell the doom of mankind. Szilard and others got that. Einstein wrote that famous memo to Roosevelt in 1939, urging him to begin the process, the bomb project. And he later said, "I made one great mistake in my life, writing the letter to President Roosevelt."
Of course.
But he and the scientists started the project as a deterrent. What they were afraid, when word spread that the Germans had split the uranium atom back in 1945, back in the late 1938, when the emigre scientists in the U.S. were terrified what would happen if Hitler got atomic bombs. So they began the bomb project, not for use as a weapon, but as a deterrent against the German bomb. But then after the Germans surrendered, we sped up the bomb project. Or after we found out in late 1944 that the Germans were not developing a bomb, then the pressure increased on Oppenheimer because they wanted to use it. They knew it was not going to be ready in time for Germany, but it was ready barely in time for Japan. And I did look at the documents, and one of the things they talk about is radiation. They knew beforehand about the radiation effects. They knew it was going to affect people in New Mexico and the surrounding states where the bomb was tested. They took precautions to protect the scientists against the effects of radiation. They didn't warn the people in New Mexico, even after the fact. They lied to them about it. And Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, General Leslie Groves, lied about the effects of the radiation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said, radiation sickness is a very pleasant way to die. First he denied that it even happened at all. It was Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett who published the first reports about radiation sickness. But the Americans covered it up as long as they could.
I believe General Leslie Groves, who in the Christopher Nolan film Oppenheimer is played by Matt Damon, I believe he'd originally said that this is just Japanese propaganda when there were reports about people dying from radiation. And then eventually he said, like you said, he told the U.S. Senate that it's radiation sickness was a very pleasant way to die.
That's the way to die. So later, Teller would say that the mutations resulting from the bomb tests might have had a beneficial effect on humanity, speeding up the process of evolution. So we've had a lot of crazies and a lot of liars. But Nolan, I don't fault him so much for that. They could have put in some warning about that. It could have taken 2 sentences. Because Oppenheimer was warned beforehand and others were quite aware. And then after the bomb, The Navy, others issued reports. And finally, Groves had to acknowledge the effects of radiation, but they were devastating. And, my friends in Japan, I take students every year to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the commemorative events, at least until COVID, for 25 years. And we spent a lot of time with survivors, Hibakusha, many of whom were my friends, many of whom have passed away. And for example, my friend Koko Tanemoto Kondo, Reverend Kyoshi Tanemoto's daughter, she was a baby, I think about 8 months at the time of the bombing. She and her mother were buried, and then they managed to get loose. And her cousin, her 3-year-old cousin and aunt, came into the city afterwards to look for them. Coco survived, but her 3-year-old cousin, who came in 3 days later, she died of radiation sickness. So we knew that the effects were lingering in the area, and we didn't do anything to treat the victims, even though we could have done some things for them.
So it's actually time. I wanted to be able to ask you about the current state of affairs and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how the significance of nuclear weapons in this situation in particular. I was going to ask you about an article that Eric Schlosser wrote in January this year. However, it is now, I believe is it 4 o'clock where you are, and you've got to prepare for another interview. So perhaps at another time we might be able to do
Mohammed, let's do another interview. We can talk about all of that.
So then we can have a standalone interview about that. So Professor Peter Kuznick, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for joining us on Truth Defense.
My pleasure, Mohammed. Thank you.